Good afternoon. Quick announcement before I start. I have this beautiful bracelet that somebody dropped out front. If it's yours, oh good, okay. I'll make sure you get it back after the meeting. Glad we found it. All right. Good afternoon. I am Melanie White, President of the Women's Club. Welcome to those of you in the auditorium, and a very special welcome to any guests that we have today. Welcome to our precious members that are viewing online. I am delighted to announce 5 new members to the Women's Club. Their names are Mary Clark, Jennifer Makoto, Mary Lou Ivy, Alex Bedford, and Ashley Lane. Yes. But let's not forget to thank their proposers, Betty Walker, Patricia Hackler, Catherine Whittam, and Elizabeth Terry Long. Thank you for proposing these members. We have found that one of our best sources for new members is from our newest members. Last week at our new member orientation, I made a couple of longtime friends that joined and then brought in their friends a month or so later. So if you are a new member, please know that you are encouraged to ask your friends to join us in the good times we're having here at the Women's Club. Please consider asking a potential member to become a Member luncheon. This is on February 10th from noon to 1:30 at the Commonwealth Club. Our Special Events Committee has planned some amazing events to keep our minds sharp and our spirits uplifted during these chilly winter days. 2 of these upcoming events are Commonwealth Travel Boutique day trips and weekend getaways on January 29th from 12:30 to 2 p.m. VPM, Virginia's Home for Public Media, is on February 5th from 12:30 to 2. A very special thank you to today's volunteers: Marion Bowes, Chair of the Day; Jen Cornell, Vice Chair of the Day. The Bowling Haxel House Foundation is serving refreshments. And a very special thank you to Lynn Still, who arranged our beautiful flowers. Now, please silence your cell phones. And now please welcome Marion Bowes as she introduces Dr. Jessica Payne.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Marianne. It's good to meet all of you. I'm a relatively new member of the club. I've only been with the club maybe just over a year. Thanks to Pat Hackler for bringing me in. Jen Cornell and I are really excited to introduce you to Dr. Jessica Payne. And candidly, she almost didn't make it here because lunch was so exciting and fascinating. So please take the time to ask her some questions. So every morning I wake up and I look at my smartwatch and I look at my sleep score, and today was not great. It was a 74, and that was a C- for those who are looking at grades. And I thought, if I mispronounce anything, if I flubber up here, it's because I didn't get any sleep last night. And then it got me thinking, like, how important is sleep? And then I got on YouTube, and 2 hours later, I've watched all of Dr. Payne's YouTube videos on sleep. So needless to say, I'm very excited to hear what she has to offer. I know all of you are as well, so thank you for being here today. Dr. Jessica Payne is a professor of psychology at the University of Notre Dame, where she directs the Sleep, Stress, and Memory Lab. Dr. Payne's research focuses on how sleep and stress independently and interactively influence learning, memory, emotion, and creativity. She teaches various courses in psychology and neuroscience, including a popular course entitled The Sleeping Brain, for which she's won numerous awards, including some from Harvard. She also won the Laird Cermak Award for her contribution to memory research, the Early Career Award from the Psychonomic Society, which is the home for scientists who study how the mind works, and she was elected as a Kavli Fellow with the National Academy of Sciences. And also, she's a native Richmonder. She was born and lived here until she was about 8 years old. So please welcome Dr. Jessica Payne.
I love you guys already. You're clapping for me. I haven't even said anything yet. All right, so first thing first, can everybody hear me? Even back there? Okay, excellent. All right, well, I want to thank the organizers again for having me because this is the place of my birth. I left when I was about 7 3/4 and I've missed it ever since. So it is so nice to be back and I just can't believe how much it's changed since the early 80s. So I am going to be speaking to you today about, let's see, we're on the wrong slide, the science of sleep and stress. And as you'll see here, I'm going to be talking about mostly sleep because I think it's the thing that we really understand the least. But I'm going to be trying to put this in a big picture perspective because I think, as many of you will agree, it is very difficult to talk about sleep without talking about stress, right? The two go hand in hand. In fact, most of the time, if you find yourself struggling to sleep, stress is one of the main culprits. So we're going to be talking about that too. But I will be putting the majority of my focus today on sleep because, and I really say this without any exaggeration, sleep truly is the most powerful tool you have at your disposal if you want your brain to be at its best. And that just becomes more and more important as we age, which is unfortunate because sleep for many of us becomes harder and harder and harder to master. But we'll talk about that, okay? Because as it turns out, a lot of what we blame on age in terms of our sleep not being as good as perhaps it once was is not due to age itself. It's due to a lot of factors surrounding age, like social support and loneliness, like exposure to light, like getting enough exercise, like underlying mental and physical conditions, and a whole host of other factors, okay? So I just want you to know from the get-go that, poor sleep and aging are not necessarily unentangleable, okay? So I guess I want to start this by getting on a soapbox just for a couple of minutes because we have known sleep is a biological necessity. So let's just start from primary scientific principles and talk about sleep. So sleep has been conserved both across evolutionary time and across species. In other words, there is not a single animal out there in nature that doesn't sleep. There's not even one exception, okay? And when I say it's been conserved across evolutionary time, by that I mean that there's not a shred of evidence that we are sleeping any less than our ancestors did. So right away, from first biological principles, that tells you that sleep is essential. It is a biological imperative. And here comes the soapbox piece. While that is so scientifically true, you couldn't possibly replicate it more times, we nonetheless live in a society where we denigrate sleep. We disrespect it. We treat people as lazy for needing it. And frankly, many of us, especially those in the corporate world, wear our sleep deprivation as if it's some badge of honor. I hear a lot of agreement there. How many of you have heard somebody say, "Oh, I'll sleep when I'm dead"? Can I just get a show of hands? Okay, so many of you. Would you like to know what my response to that is? Okay, so you'll be dead a lot sooner, and you'll be much stupider in the meantime. Okay, because that is what the science shows so definitively. So I don't have time today to lead what I'd love to do, which is some sort of introspective conversation where we think about why is that? Why is it that we have this phenomenon that we have to do, that occupies, by the way, roughly 1/3 of our lives? And yet, rather than trying to figure out why we do that and why it's so necessary and how it might benefit it, instead we act as if people are just lazy for needing sleep at all. I think that's a lot about us being the descendants of Puritans. There's so much we could talk about, but I think we need to start struggling to try to understand it, because we need to get beyond what is truly cultural mythology and into what the science has to say about why this is so important and why we must do it if we are going to keep our minds, our brains, and all of the many cognitive and emotional functions it supports in tip-top shape, especially as we age. Okay, now it's funny, I'm not seeing any unhappy looks. In fact, I'm feeling a lot of agreement, which makes me really feel like I'm home and I'm in the right space, because a lot of time I start getting pushback at this point, where it's like, yeah, but Jess, we live in this relentless 24/7 world. And while that might be true, there's just no way. There's no way we can get the sleep we need. It's just impossible, given the demands on our time, whether those are professional demands or personal and family demands, and I just get a lot of pushback. And so at that point I say, okay, all right, well, if you want to just accept that we've become a culture of walking zombies who are completely exhausted, and if you decide that there's nothing we can do about it, that you want to go through your days completely sleep deprived, well, then what the data has to say about that is that you might as well be drunk. Except you're going to be having a lot less fun. Now, you all know this right here. You know that the relationship between alcohol and performance is negative. You all know this, right? Meaning the drunker you get, the more your performance is going to fail. But what you may not know, which by the way is equally what we consider a law in science, considering how strong it is that the exact same relationship holds for sleep deprivation. So the more sleep deprived you get, the worse your performance gets. And I just want to show you that this is just across a single day. Don't even get me started about what happens when you're curtailing sleep over weeks and months and years. The situation gets much, much worse. So I think this should be a wake-up call, if you will, because how many of you would ever even dream of picking up your grandchild from school drunk? But we routinely as a society do our very most important tasks in a state of sleep deprivation, which is just as dangerous. And for those of you who are statistically savvy out there in the audience, you might be able to see that this is actually a stronger correlation. These dots hug that line a little bit more closely, and it's also steeper. So it's actually a little more dangerous, if you will, to be sleep deprived than it is drunk. And yet nobody's regulating drowsy driving. So again, as a culture, I think we need to step back and really think about what are the forces that are making us so sleep deprived, because we know that Americans are sleep deprived. All right? Now, I want this to be at least a little bit interactive, so the next thing I'm going to ask you, and I just want you to don't think about it very much, just yell out the answer. How many hours of sleep do human beings need to get at night, or per each 24-hour period? Okay, so I heard 110, which is nice, but mostly I'm hearing 8 with some 7s intermixed. Is that fair? All right, well, here's the scientific truth about that we are actually, okay, that's not going to work, that's all right. We are normally distributed when it comes to sleep. So if you look at this, this is what's called the normal distribution of the bell curve. And where we get that number 8, which you hear all the time in the media, which kind of drives me nuts because it just is an average. Where we get that number is because the vast, overwhelming majority of us need somewhere between 7 and 9 hours of sleep. Okay, so in a way, 8 is not a terrible thing to aim for, but it doesn't necessarily represent anybody because it's just a mean, it's just an average. So what sleep really looks like in nature, in human nature, is that you actually do have some lucky souls who genuinely only need 4 hours of sleep. And I am not saying get by on. And I'd frankly like you to start thinking about how much sleep do you really think you need in order to be at your best, not how much do I need in order to just kind of get by, all right? There are some people who legitimately only need 4 hours. I have been studying sleep for over 20 years, and this is so statistically rare, I have never found such a person. I have found a lot of people who think they're that person. You've probably heard a lot of people, CEOs, you've probably heard of people like Thomas Edison, who frankly also napped during the day, even though he only did sleep about 4 hours a night. There are a lot of people who want to be that person because it makes them feel like Superwoman or Superman. And if you think about that, I think if you mine it for all it is, it means that person thinks that they're somehow more worthy or better because they need less sleep, which again goes back to what is it about sleep that makes us hate it so much? okay? And I think the answer to that is people feel like they're wasting their time. They're wasting their human capital, maybe they're wasting their potential. So my job today is going to be to show you that that is not true. In fact, it's the opposite. But first, let me also point out that there are some people, now if this is the normal distribution, that means that all of this is normal, okay? It's just very rare as you get several standard deviations from the mean. So when we come to 12 hours, while again, that's statistically very rare, I have a lot of people who say, I think I'm that person who needs 12 hours. I say, why? Well, it's because I sleep and I sleep and I sleep and I never feel well rested. Well, frankly, that raises the specter of sleep apnea. And I want to pause here and let you know what apnea really is, because I think at this point, beyond any shadow of a doubt, we know that there is a very strong connection between apnea and heart attacks and strokes. And apnea is, for the most part, very, very treatable. So what an apnea is a complete cessation of breathing, and every time that happens, the brain doesn't get any oxygen. And the brain, by the way, is an oxygen hog. And in the worst cases of apnea, which by the way are becoming more and more prevalent as we as a society gain weight, especially if you're carrying it around your neck, in the worst cases of sleep apnea, we'll see up to 100 or more of these apnea events per hour. Now, every time your brain fails to get oxygen, it has to actually awaken or arouse to get a breath. But the thing is, people don't remember those arousals. So if I'm looking at your brain output, I can see awakening, 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 awakening over and over and over again, because sleep is so choppy and interrupted and fragmented, as we call it. But people don't remember that. So their experience of it is I'm just sleeping all the time, but I don't feel well rested. I always feel tired. So two things. If that's you, or if it's your bed partner, spouse, somebody you love, please have them go get a sleep study. I believe that we should have all had a sleep study when we were about 25, and we should have one at least every 10 years. But in this case, you have to be your own best medical advocate. Also, really loud snoring is already on the cusp of what we'd consider a sleep disorder. It just doesn't quite make the cut. But the second that loud snoring turns into choking, kind of gasping for breath, that's an apnea event. And if you hear, usually it's hard to know if it's you yourself doing it, but if your spouse or significant other is doing that, or your child, you really need to have them go get a sleep study. And you just demand that of your primary care physician, okay? Because apnea is treatable, and it really can lead to some pretty horrific outcomes. Okay, well, I keep talking about sleep, but what do I really mean by sleep? Sleep is actually multifaceted. It's consisted of a whole host of different, totally different brain states. In fact, rapid eye movement sleep, which you might have heard of, has much more in common with wakefulness than it does with any of the other sleep stages. So this is what a good night of sleep looks like. You can kind of ignore the 11 to 7, but I'm just going to take you through what we call sleep architecture. And I'll admit right away that this is the perfect, beautiful sleep of an 8-year-old. Okay, this probably isn't going to look like anybody here, and yet in a way it's what we should all be striving for. So here's what happens when everything is going well. So the first thing is you should fall asleep quickly. Sleep onset should happen quickly. If you are routinely lying awake for 20 or 30 minutes a night struggling to get to sleep, and if that's associated with any kind of daytime complaint, like I don't feel well, or I don't feel at my best, or I can't get enough done, that's all it takes to get a diagnosis of insomnia. Now, what I thought would come up in our lunch, and I guarantee will be a question, is that there are actually two types of insomnia. There's what I just described, which is called sleep onset insomnia, where you cannot go to sleep at the beginning of the night. And then there's a second type, which usually happens right around 3 a.m. I call them the 3 a.m. screamies, where you wake up in the middle of the night and you can't get back to sleep. The reason that's so common right around 3 a.m. is rapid eye movement sleep, which I just told you has a lot in common with wakefulness and is an extremely active brain state. You're already kind of riding the cusp of wakefulness anyway. When you transition into REM, becomes extremely prevalent right around 3 a.m. And in fact, when we look at the distribution of these different sleep stages, after you've fallen asleep, again, hopefully quickly, you dive down into the deepest type of sleep you get, which is called slow wave sleep. And that's the type of sleep where the brain is really locked in. It's very hard to wake somebody out of it. And you'll notice that you get the lion's share of slow wave sleep early in the night. And incidentally, anytime you wake up, the brain has to go back through these sleep stages. It just does it faster. All right? So sleep is front-loaded with slow wave sleep. Now I want you to juxtapose that with rapid eye movement sleep, which you see in the pinkish bars, and you get the majority of that late in the night. And in fact, it's common to sometimes wake up out of rapid eye movement sleep because it is a very active brain state. And when people do that, they will often at least briefly remember their dreams. Now, you actually dream throughout the entire night. It's just that rapid eye movement sleep, when people wake up out of that, that's associated with the characteristic dreams that are really crazy and bizarre and fragmented and emotional, and they just make no sense, right? You know, like there's a lion chasing me and then suddenly it turns into my mother-in-law. That's the kind of dream that is. I'm so glad that some of you can identify. Okay, and then there's a third major type of sleep, which is called stage 2. So slow wave sleep and stage 2 are both non-REM, non-rapid eye movement types of sleep. What's important for you to understand here, since we're going to talk about the brain and all the cognition it supports, is that each of these different types of sleep supports a very important cognitive ability. So slow wave sleep, again, which comes first in the night, incredibly important for what we call memory consolidation, which is simply the ability for you to learn something new and then actually remember it later, right? So if you want your memories to stay good, especially as you age, you really want high quality slow wave sleep. Rapid eye movement, on the other hand, is extremely important for two major things. The first is emotion regulation, which is the ability to tamp down stress and tamp down the negative things that we experience or even think about. And the second thing is any type of innovation, insight, or creativity seems to be really locked to REM. And then stage 2 sleep, which you can see is pretty evenly distributed throughout the night. This is also a very light stage of sleep that it's okay to wake up out of. You do not want to wake up out of slow wave sleep, which I'll ask you to remember when we talk about strategic napping, okay? But stage 2 sleep is a fairly light stage of sleep, and it sort of does a little bit of both. It jumpstarts the memory consolidation process, and it also helps you start to not just consolidate, but start to integrate and synthesize information so that you can find commonalities, which in many cases is a precursor of having creative insights, all right? So each and every one of these different stages or types of sleep is not only vastly different from one another in terms of its neurobiology and neuroelectrophysiology, they are literally different stages of consciousness. So you're never unconscious, by the way, while you're sleeping, right? I mean, you don't roll out of bed, hopefully. You know where the edges of your bed are. I mean, if you do, then talk to me after this. Kids do, most adults don't. And then the last thing I want you to know about this is that what we call each cycle, an ultradian or REM cycle, is about 90 minutes long. Also important when it comes to napping. So you go down into slow wave sleep, up into REM, down into stage 2, up into REM. Each one of those takes about 90 minutes. And you really want to preserve those at all costs until you bump into the circadian rhythm, which is something else we can talk about. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and put up what I think is the most important slide of the entire talk. And it's this. Your sleeping brain is not doing nothing. It may look like it's resting. The person's laying down. It doesn't look like you're being productive. I understand that. But your sleeping brain is highly, highly intensively active. And it's active in the very regions you want it to be active if you care about all of these different types of cognition that we've already been discussing. Now, get this. Not only is the brain really active during sleep, but in rapid eye movement sleep in particular, the regions I'm going to tell you about are more active than they are when you're wide awake. What regions are these? Well, first and foremost is an area called the hippocampus and surrounding cortex. This is actually a bilateral structure. If you were to drill into both of your temples here, you'd hit it, which I absolutely don't recommend, because people who have bilateral damage to the hippocampus are rendered so profoundly amnesic, they can quite literally never, ever, ever learn anything new. All right, that's how important the hippocampus is to learning and memory. It's wildly active during sleep. Why? Because sleep is a privileged time where you actually consolidate memories. Another region that's actually more active during sleep than during wakefulness is right next door. This is called the amygdala. The amygdala and the hippocampus, these are both evolutionarily quite ancient structures. I mean, even lizards have amygdalae. Again, it's bilateral. This is wildly activated during sleep, and its role is to help you process emotions, especially negative emotions like fear and anxiety. So when you're sleeping, you're not just processing all the information that you've encoded during the day, you're also processing the emotions of the day. And your brain is kind of highlighting the negative ones, which is good, and that's adaptive up to a point, but it can get out of control, which is why it's good that there's another region that's also active, which is in the medial prefrontal cortex, right behind your forehead here. This is a much newer evolutionary structure. Okay, this is one of the areas of the brain that's still developing into your early 20s. It's also the newest when it comes to the human brain. And its role is to put a brake on the amygdala. So you've got the amygdala processing stress and all of this negativity, but it's doing it under the down regulatory control of a much higher level system that keeps it from spiraling out into, let's say, an anxiety disorder or a case of clinical depression. So you want the brain to process and remember the negative, but not to the point where you're reliving the negative later. And the sleeping brain does this dance that allows it to do both. So the reason this slide is so important is because most people who think that sleep is a waste of time don't understand what sleep is doing. If you shortchange yourself of sleep, you're shortchanging your intellect. You're shortchanging your ability to learn, remember. You're shortchanging your ability to regulate stress and emotions, to be creative, and a whole host of other things. All the things that make us human and make us smart and make us individually very interesting. Those are things that I actually believe. It may even be that sleep evolved. I mean, remember, if it takes up a third of our lives, it's got to be doing something really important. So one of the reasons it may have evolved is because, look, the human brain cannot very effectively do two things. It can't both encode new information, take new information in, and consolidate it and process it. It can't do those things simultaneously very well. This is why we need breaks throughout the day, because you want the brain to be online like yours are right now. You're listening to me, hopefully you're learning something new. But then you need the brain to go offline to consolidate it so you can remember it later, and to also find commonalities in your life that you can link it up to, which is the act of making meaning. And it's the act of really enriched learning. So you really have these online, offline brain states, of which, when it comes to offline states, sleep is truly the gold standard. And without it, we really would not be able to process, find commonalities, drive insight, or learn anything new and keep it in our heads for very long. Okay? So given all this information we're bombarded by during the day, we really have to have both. Now, because we're talking about rapid eye movement sleep here, there is one very curious thing. There's another region of your frontal lobe, which again, that's the most newly evolved part of the brain. It's a little further back than the part that helps with emotion regulation. And we actually call this system the executive command center of the brain. And it's completely switched off during rapid eye movement sleep in particular. Completely turned off. You should all be very happy mine is on right now, because it's what's telling me I can't fly through the room. Aren't you grateful? Yeah. That would lead to some interesting conversations later. But when you're sleeping and that's switched off, what can you do in your rapid eye movement sleep dreams? You can fly. So what's happening here specifically during REM is you're consolidating all these memories, you're processing all this information and emotion, but you're doing it without this stern CEO, and it's a boring CEO, by the way, saying, don't try anything new, don't think outside of the box, let's do things the way we've always done them. Instead, you can try out any permutation of any possibility you could imagine. And frankly, that you may not be able to imagine while you're awake, because your brain is too entrained to do what's obvious. While you're sleeping, the brain literally regionally communicates one region to another in a way it simply cannot do during wakefulness. You never see this pattern of regional activations and deactivations during wakefulness. And it's a good thing during wakefulness, but I believe it's also a very good thing during sleep because it allows for creative processing and new ideas. So without sleep, we'd miss out on all of this. So again, sleep is the furthest thing from a waste of time. All right, now given what I've just told you about all this activation in memory-relevant regions of the brain like the hippocampus, it won't surprise you to learn that I built the biggest part of my scientific career around showing over and over and over again how beneficial sleep is for memory. And I thought about just putting up some interesting data to prove it to you because I'm a scientist, but then I thought, oh, maybe I will turn them into temporary research participants. All right? So here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm just gonna present you with a list of words. Okay, and all I'd like you to do is pay attention to the screen because you're gonna learn a list of words and then I'm gonna be testing your memories later. Oh no, okay. Come on, confidence, everybody. Here we go. Are you ready? Here come the words. Okay, I can't help but say that, it would be so fun if we had more time, because this is a big enough group, I think I could show this in real time. So we divide the room in half. You would be the experimental group, you would be the control group. So the control group, 10 minutes, you'd be involved in scintillating conversation with me. And this side of the room, you take a 10-minute nap. Some of you look like you could use it, okay? Which is a good thing. Hey, I may be the only professor in the known universe who's complimented when my students fall asleep in my classes. Because I don't think they're bored. I think, oh, this is so meaningful and exciting and informative to them. They need to put their head down so they can consolidate and remember this information better. And it would be interesting, because I think this is a big enough group where in real time we could show that the group who took even a very brief nap would outperform the wake group when it comes to a memory task. But we don't have time to do that, so I'm just going to ask you to all play along. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put some words up, and your job is, if the word was on the list, just raise your hand. Okay, but none of this confidence, all right? And if the word was not there, you just leave your hands down. Okay, everybody ready? Here comes the first word. Excellent memories. Okay, see? There's nothing to be worried about. All right, next word. All right, excellent, very good. Next word. Very good. Next one. Good. Next word. Except it wasn't there. No. No. It is not the presence of the synonym position on that word list that just technically led you to have a false memory. Now, almost all of you raised your hands. Here's the good news. Rather than chiding you for having what is technically a false memory, instead I'm going to compliment you, because what your brain just did there is actually very sophisticated, and it's a type of higher level cognition that we call gist extraction. Your brain just extracted out the overall meaning or gist of the list. Think about it. If you went home and talked to a spouse or a child about this later, you wouldn't be like, oh, there's this professor, and she put up a list of words consisting of nurse, sick, lawyer, Spock. You're not Spock. You'd say she put up a list about doctors, right? Now, again, I want you to think about all the information that your brain is glutted by during the day, and I want you to ask yourself, what would happen if you kept track of every single detail? You'd be glutted. You truly would be glutted. You would not be able to see the forest through the trees, okay? So it's incredibly efficient what your brain just did, even though technically it's false. And the reason I say it's not because of the synonym position is there isn't always one. So the way we create these lists is we give a group about this side a word like doctor and say just generate the first words that come to mind. Window, what are the first words that come to mind? So really this word doctor encapsulates the overall gist or meaning of that list, and people invariably will falsely remember it even though it wasn't there, because it represents the essence or takeaway meaning of that list. That's actually highly adaptive. Now, when you do an experiment like the one I just described, where you let some people sleep and some people you keep awake for a little while, what you see is that two types of performance in this task benefit. So one, people do remember more of the details or the words that really were there, like nurse, and they remember more than the wake group. So one way to understand what sleep does for memory is it makes you much more resistant to forgetting. But then it also boosts this ability to kind of see and extract the gist. And both of those things are incredibly beneficial. So sleep truly does benefit not just memory, but also things that stem from memory, these higher level types of cognition, including, by the way, creativity. So sleep really does help us detect patterns in data or information that are really hard to see during wakefulness, extract information and make these insightful connections. Have any of you actually ever gone to bed or slept on a problem to get to an answer? I'll bet some of you actually have. And there are many examples of, authors and painters doing this. Salvador Dali would actually go to sleep and paint his dreams, it got very interesting because he was one of these many people who would fall asleep with something, like a spoon or a metal object that would clatter when it hit the floor. And when you go into rapid eye movement sleep, by the way, your body is totally paralyzed except for your eyes. So as soon as he'd go into REM sleep, he'd drop the spoon, the clattering of the spoon would wake him up, and then he'd paint his relatively insane dreams, right? Incredibly creative brain state, though. He's leveraging it. But there are so many examples of this in the art, but you can also find examples of sleeping on a problem to get to an insight in the scientific annals of history. So this is Kekulé, okay? And this is a famous example because he was trying to figure out the molecular structure of benzene. You don't even have to know what benzene is. It's just a molecule. It's really important for life. He was trying to figure out its physical structure. And as is true for most of the work in the insight literature, sometimes you get stuck before you actually have an aha moment. You hit an impasse. And that's what happened to him. But he did really what we should all do, which is that he took a nap. He took a nap, and in this case, he did have a dream. You don't have to dream or remember the dream to have sleep benefit insight. But in his case, he did. And what he dreamt about was these atoms, these molecules that are gambling before his eyes in the dream. And all of a sudden, they kind of line up in this circular shape, which in the dream turns into a snake biting its own tail, and wham, he wakes up with that image in his mind, and he realizes that the structure of benzene is hexagonal. And then he rushes to the lab and works out the consequences of his hypotheses. If you think he's alone, Otto Loewi, who discovered chemical transmission and won the Nobel Prize, almost exactly the same type of experience. So what you're doing when you sleep on a problem is you're leveraging a different type of brain processing to solve it. It's actually a really smart thing to do when it comes to decision making and creativity. And for any of you who have students who are in school, you can also do it with memory for tests. So what I always tell my students is both of these things. If you are studying for an exam, look, I'm primarily a memory researcher, okay? And the two things you need to do if you truly want to remember things in the long run are, one, you want to stagger your studying, right? You want to stagger your practice. This is true for sports too. You don't want to try to cram everything in at once. And the second thing is you want to sleep. I mean, it drives me crazy at Notre Dame when I hear students walking across campus bragging about how little sleep they got the night before the test because they studied so hard, right? Because they're doing exactly the wrong thing. You want to not be cramming, you want to be spacing out the studying, and then you want to review your notes one last time right before you go to sleep, because you're kind of telling the sleeping brain what to selectively remember. And in the same way, if you're trying to solve a problem, personal dilemma, or something creative, it's the same thing, but you're kind of thinking about it right before bed, telling the sleeping brain what to focus on. So you can kind of direct it in that way. All right? But wait, there's more, because sleep doesn't just help memory and higher level cognition and insight and creativity, it also helps us regulate emotion. Now, I want you to ask yourself, in today's society, how important is it that we regulate stress and negative emotions? I think it's critical for our mental health and maybe even our health as a society, okay? Sleep is a natural, built-in stress and negativity regulator. Now, I'm going to give you an example. This is a real experiment. So if we were just talking about, having a nap group and one group who just stays awake for a little while, but there's no sleep deprivation. Instead, if you change the experiment, so you have a group who sleeps well across a night, but then you have another group who you keep awake, that's your sleep deprivation condition, and then you compare them, you can also learn some fascinating facts. And in this particular experiment I'm going to tell you about, we gave everybody things to try to remember, either after a night of sleep or sleep deprivation. And these were pictures. Some of the pictures were extremely positive, some of the pictures were just neutral, and some of them were very, very negative. And what we find is this, that in that sleep deprivation group, people had atrocious memory for neutral information and even positive. But they had spectacular, arguably too good memory when it came to remembering the negative. And when we looked to see what was going on in the brain that was leading to this, what we call a negative memory bias, where your brain starts to only track the negative in your environment, what we find is exactly what you'd expect. In the sleep deprivation group, when people tried to remember these negative images, they had a wildly overactivated bilateral amygdala. Why? Because they didn't sleep, and therefore they didn't get the benefit of that higher level break coming to keep it under control. Does that make sense? So that means that the amygdala kind of takes over, this more primitive part of the brain, zero ability to regulate this, and you end up with this excessive memory for the negative. Now, I would actually argue that this is adaptive in the short term. If our ancestors on the savannah weren't sleeping, why would that have been? Something was probably trying to eat them, right? So you better be awake. You better be awake, and you better be tracking the negative things that are going on. But this really, our bodies didn't evolve to do this on a continuous basis. So I do not worry when people go through periods of time where they're sleep deprived. I worry, I mean, for those of us who have kids, right? It's a part of it. Our brains are incredibly plastic and they can recover from a lot. So I don't get worried about this when it's temporary, but when it becomes perpetual, again, when you're living under, say, chronic stress or conditions that won't allow you to sleep for months and years and then decades and more, that's where this gets really dangerous, because that's when this negative memory bias that benefits you in the short run becomes profoundly maladaptive. Guess what all anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, and depression have in common? It is this focus on the negative, whether it's something fearful or something sad. And what I'm saying is you shape your brain both functionally and structurally to a point where you really almost cannot learn or remember or think anything else, because you're set up physically and structurally to only attune to the negative. So it's adaptive in the short term, becomes very maladaptive in the long term. So now we're going to talk about what can we do about it, all right? I probably don't have to tell you any of that about sleep deprivation. How many of you have grandkids? What happens if your 3-year-old doesn't get their nap? Right? They become emotionally dysregulated, okay? All right, so here are the tips and takeaways. I always like to give you some actionable advice. And I think that the first and most important one may simply be to try to get 20 extra minutes of sleep a day. And if you think about it, there are 3 different ways to do that. You can either get really religious about going to sleep 20 minutes earlier. If you're more of a night type, like me, you can sleep in 20 minutes later and don't hit the snooze button. I did that twice this morning. I thought I'm such a hypocrite because I knew I was going to tell you that, but don't do that. It's better to just let the brain stay locked in. And frankly, the best way to do it, and we know this from quite a few studies at this point, is to leverage daytime napping. I really am on the record saying we never should have stopped doing this in kindergarten. These brief offline periods of time, ideally you nap, but even if you don't fall asleep, that's okay, are just wonderful for all of the cognitive functions that your brain supports. Now, it's really important that if you try this, you're going to keep those naps in the afternoon, and you're going to keep them either really short, and when I say 20 minutes, I mean you set your alarm for 20 minutes. We now have evidence that as few as 6 to 7 minutes of sleep benefits memory about 3-fold, 2.5 to 3-fold, because it jumpstarts the memory consolidation process. And it may be that the hippocampus is kind of filling up during the day, so you're kind of cleaning the cache, if you will. So you've swept out some of that memory, you've consolidated it into other parts of the brain, and now your hippocampus is ready to take in new information, okay? So very brief bouts of sleep can do this. And if you're extremely tired, that you can also try, like on a weekend or a time that works for you, to sleep 90 minutes, so you get through a whole sleep cycle. But it's very important to keep the naps either very, very short or try to nail about 90 minutes if you're really tired. If you can't or don't want to do this, I always talk about engaging in sleep proxies instead. That's any other way you might take the brain offline. That's meditating, doing yoga, getting out for a relaxing walk, exercising and trying not to ruminate on things like that. Anything else that takes your brain off task counts. It may not be quite as good as sleep, but it's actually pretty close. The third thing is to minimize distractions at night. I can't emphasize this enough, because if you're checking that last stressful email, or you're watching the news, or even if you're, watching Game of Thrones or something like that, you're probably engaging in stimulating information encoding. And not only are you doing that, but you're doing it on a device that emits blue light. Now, light in the blue end of the spectrum is fantastic for your brain in the morning. One of the best things I can recommend to all of you is that first thing in the morning, you just get out briefly into the light, even on a cloudy day. But blue light is terrible for your brain at night. So you do not want this arousing content entering your brain, especially when delivered on a blue light emitting device. This one's sad for me. Don't drink alcohol before bed. I will tell you that the second I got tenure, I started studying to be a sommelier. I love wine, really passionate about it. It's very sad to me though. Well, first of all, I should say that the Surgeon General, I actually think this has recently changed, but until recently was recommending, that women could safely have 1 drink a night, men could have 2. I thought, I'm the size of a medium man, I can at least have 2. But the important thing seems to be that you do not drink too close to bedtime, and the bad news is as you age, that really probably means we should all just drink at lunch. I'm kidding. But what used to be fine for me, which is like quitting an hour before bed, doesn't work anymore. Now I really have to make sure I clear 2 to 3 hours of being done with the wine before I go to bed. So if you're having trouble with your sleep, I want you to look at these 3 things. Alcohol, either eliminating it or making sure you don't drink too late at night. That differs for everybody, by the way. Caffeine, same thing. So caffeine actually is different. It has a really long half-life of like 11 or 12 hours. So you might want to eliminate that entirely, see if that helps, or just make sure you're only drinking very early in the morning. And then exercise, I'm going to go crazy about how great exercise is for the brain and sleep, but you don't want to engage in extremely vigorous exercise right before bed, except for sex. But that's because sex gives you all other counterbalancing hormones, okay? So sex is fine, but go get on your treadmill and just don't sprint before bedtime, and you'll be fine. But moderate exercise is very good for sleep. And then the other thing I think that does get harder as we age is to really try to keep a consistent routine, wake up at the same time every day, all right? And I'm anticipating questions about that, which I'm happy to field in a little bit here. Okay. So that is the sleep section, and now I'm going to transition and talk about stress, which of course is interrelated, because most of the time when you're not sleeping, it's due to a stressor. And most people understand that connection, but they don't know that actually sleep deprivation is itself a stressor. It's a terrible thing to say, but there's the reason that sleep deprivation is used as a torture technique, okay? It's tremendously stressful. It leads to this huge dump of cortisol into the bloodstream. So you get into this problem where the more stressed you are, the less you sleep, but the less you sleep, the more stressed you are. So you can really get stuck into what I call the sleep stress snowball, which we'll talk about at the very end. And also, I don't like to use scare tactics at all in my lectures. I just don't believe in doing it. And I don't want to scare you with any gory images, but I do need to make sure you understand that chronically elevated stress and very persistently high levels of cortisol are toxic to the brain. And they will start to kill off portions of the neuron. So this is a neuron in the hippocampus. A neuron is a brain cell. And as you can see, they really start to shrink under high levels of cortisol and stress. So we talk about stress as if it's this murky kind of hypothetical construct, this thing that we all have in society, but stress truly can get under the skin. And if left unchecked, it can profoundly damage the brain. But that is not to say that all stress is bad. It's not true. You actually want moderate stress. So when we talk about cortisol, how many of you have heard of cortisol? Probably all of you. All right, well, cortisol is not bad. It's a glucocorticoid. All right, its job is to mobilize glucose and to shunt it, that's sugar, and shunt it to the muscles so that you can run, to the brain so you can make quick decisions, frankly, to give you enough energy to just get up and get out of bed in the morning. So cortisol is not in and of itself bad. It's just that we live in a society where stress levels have become higher and higher and more chronically so. But going all the way back to the very early 1900s, we've known that the relationship between stress and performance is this inverted U-shaped curve. Where actually very, very low levels of stress and arousal or very high levels are not optimal for performance. You actually want stress to be moderate because you want to have that energy to get up and get things done and get them done well. When you look at the different regions of the brain we've been talking about, and you look at what happens to them under different levels of stress and cortisol, you see really different trajectories. So in blue here is the hippocampus, and you can see it really follows that same inverted U-shaped curve, where it very much likes moderate levels of stress, but boy, does it start to tank at high levels. Whereas the amygdala, which is responsible for processing negative emotions like fear and anxiety, it just ramps up and up and up and up. So the idea is once you have the brain in this high stress state, what happens to cognition? And we've shown over and over and over again in the lab, and not just my lab, but others, that high stress really does start to change and in many cases impair performance. So if you're wondering how we do that, well, we have freshmen give a speech in front of a panel of judges. And they already don't like public speaking, but unbeknownst to them, this panel of judges, who are older than they are, has been expressly trained not to make any facial emotions at all, except for maybe minor little, shows of boredom or displeasure. Now, it's interesting because humans, this is a psychosocial stressor, and humans are a social creature, and boy, does this stress them out. And we know that because we can analyze cortisol in their saliva, and boop, they get very, very stressed out during this task, all right? So once we have the brain incubating in all this cortisol and other stress hormones, what happens? And I'm gonna give you the example of another memory task, or in this case, people are watching a slideshow and they're learning about this event. It's this mother and her little boy, and they're leaving home in the morning, and they're going to visit the father at work, and everything is neutral. But midway through this, the little boy is hit by a car and his legs are severed. And I'm not even gonna put the slide up there. I used to do that. I'm thinking, wow, why are you doing that, okay? But again, like many of our emotional experiences, it actually has both neutral and negative features to it. And given that you have the amygdala doing one thing and the hippocampus doing the other, it may not surprise you to know that the different types of memory in this task really have different results. So people have a really hard time under stress remembering anything neutral, but they actually are much, much better at remembering the negative. Now, for those of you that are paying close attention, this looks a lot like the sleep deprivation effect, right? Where you see this like real problem for the neutral, but an enhancement of the negative. So again, what do sleep and stress have in common? Cortisol. The only way for me to produce higher levels of cortisol in human beings in the lab outside of the speech task is to simply sleep deprive them. So that's the common denominator, and stress really is behind both. So sleep deprivation and stress truly do go hand in hand in a lot of cases. So this may make you wonder, well, all right, but society is stressful, right? Like especially right now. It really is. We're facing climate change. There are all sorts of political things going on, let's just say, and it is a difficult time. There's a lot to process and cope with. So how do we go about not being so stressed out in these busy situations that we find ourselves in? And I really think it all starts by understanding that stress, by its very definition, is a response or a reaction to a stressor, which means that it is under your control to a large degree, okay? We know from, again, 100 years worth of data, that the important factor really does seem to be how well people cope with stress, rather than how much stress they actually face, which actually is what gives us this topic of resilience and starting to study how some people go about being more resilient than others. And I can tell you from a neuroscience perspective, it all boils down to harnessing the brain's relaxation response, which is housed in a part of the nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system. Now look, your nervous system is just the brain, your spinal cord, and all the peripheral nerves. It's divided in half. So you have the sympathetic side, which is what we've been talking about. That's what makes you stressed out, makes you secrete cortisol, makes your heart beat faster. But you have an entire other side of your nervous system, which is designed to do the opposite. It's designed to calm you down and relax you, to reduce cortisol, to reduce blood pressure, and to reduce heart rate. And we really, I think, need to learn to tune this up or tone this part of our nervous system up as if it were a muscle in preparation for the stresses we are going to invariably face as a human species, right? Part of being human is stress. So how do we best face it? We build up this part of our nervous system. And in terms of actionable advice, if you want to try to keep your stress moderate, the first thing you want to do is your best to protect your sleep. Because again, sleep is a built-in natural stress regulator. The second thing you want to do is make sure to get your exercise. In fact, when it comes to just basic neuronal mechanics, basic brain mechanics, I would argue that on a day-to-day basis, sleep and exercise are the two best things you can make sure you try to do. Another big one that keeps coming up in the literature is social support and connectedness. Those of us who have richer, not necessarily bigger, but richer social support networks have lower levels of cortisol at rest. I think this is particularly important now that we're talking about loneliness as an epidemic, especially post-COVID. Optimism, people who are either naturally optimistic or who really learn to be, lower levels of cortisol even at rest, which means that you're in a better place to respond to these stressors that are invariably going to occur. And then finally, in terms of tuning this up, this part of your nervous system up, you really want to engage in some kind of daily relaxation. So meditation is probably the best studied of that right now. But any type of relaxation you can think of, whether it's, scanning the body, relaxing your major muscle groups, doing any of those sleep proxies we talk about, those are going to activate the parasympathetic side of your nervous system, activate the relaxation response, and calm you down. And I don't think it'll end up just being meditation, because I think there are a lot of things like it that we'll be studying soon, but I am going to call it out as one of the most exciting neuroscience findings in the last 15 years, because what we're showing now is that regular meditation practice, and I'm not talking about going and living in ashram for a year, daily meditation practice, brief practice over time, not only changes the function of the brain, but its physical structure. So when you lose neural real estate because of stress, as it erodes your brain cells, what we're showing here is that meditation and other types of relaxation activities actually build tissue back up, and they build it up in the very regions of the brain, like the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is the heart of the downregulation of the amygdala and the stress response, that's so important for emotion and stress regulation. So your brain actually gets bigger in the regions that help you keep excessive stress and negativity at bay. Okay? So I'm running out of time, but I'm just going to very briefly touch on positive emotion, because this, I'll admit, is a newer area of study in the lab, but it's got me incredibly excited, because when we even give really kind of minor positivity manipulations, right? We're not telling people in the positivity group that they won the lottery. We're maybe greeting them with a warm smile, as opposed to the control group who we just hand some paperwork to, and giving them a little bag of candy wrapped up in a bow. Doesn't take that much to be kind to people. And those little tiny positivity manipulations change performance in ways that have just blown my mind. So all of a sudden, you see that you're improving memory and cognition. And in fact, one of the things you do is you flip that whole negativity bias so that people actually show better memory for neutral and positive things. But almost any cognitive task I can think to give human subjects, they get better at it if you induce a positive mood. Which makes me wonder, how many of you feel pretty positive right now? You're like, I'm afraid to raise my hand. Why is she asking that? Okay. Well, in that case, how many of you have heard of the remote associates task, or the RAT? It's a terrible name for short. Okay. Well, let's see if the positivity helps you. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put 3 words up on the computer screen, and your job is to find a 4th word that associates them. Sometimes it forms a compound word, but not necessarily. It's going to make sense once you start doing it, so don't worry. I'm going to put up 3 words. You're going to shout out the 4th word when it comes to mind, out loud, okay? We'll see if anybody gets it. Ready for the first 3? Cracker, union, rabbit. See how fast this is, by the way? So I was telling the organizers, the people I had lunch with earlier on, that I give this task, I used to give it at Harvard, I give it now at Notre Dame, I routinely work for Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. It stumps younger people. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the average age of this room is not 30. The reason I am pointing this out is because we tend to think of age as always being a bad thing for cognition, and it's not true. This is one of these tasks where you just solved that so fast, and it was, I don't know how many of you. Let's see if you can get another one, all right? Here we go. Note, dive, chair. This is a harder one. Somebody's saying it. See? All right, so you sit there at Goldman Sachs and nobody says anything. It's actually really bad. Hi. So for those of you who aren't getting it, the first one is Jack. Cracker Jack, Union Jack, and Jack Rabbit. The answer to the second one is high. High note, high dive, high chair. All right, third and final one. Here it comes. Tooth, potato, heart. Wow. All right, so here's what happens with younger audiences. Here's what happens. So first of all, they can't get the second one, and that's awkward for me, right? That's bad as a speaker. You're like, uh-oh. It was supposed to be hard. Never mind. We'll go to the third one. People say ache. Did anybody's mind go to ache? Toothache, heartache? But you didn't get stuck there. So here's what I think happens with age. I think that it expands your, like literally to be creative, to have insight, you have to quite literally step outside of the box. And to see that there are better answers. We try to lead you down the garden path, like with egg. And it just doesn't seem to impede people who are a little older. And now we've shown this. I actually did this so much in audiences who are a little bit older that I went back and proved it in the lab, that older adults not only can solve more of these, but they do it like 5 times faster. So this is a type of cognition that must be tracking discursive knowledge, broader meaning. You know, we shouldn't be testing you on things that you only did in college. You're not doing that stuff anymore. It's not important anymore. Your goal states have changed, right? So I'm telling you this seriously, like we as neuroscientists and psychologists keep saying like, ooh, aging is bad for cognition. Not always, all right? So you should give yourself a round of applause, I think. All right, and here's the intersection with positivity. In the lab, I can actually make you better or worse at this task by either inducing you into a positive state, in which case you can suddenly solve many more of these rat problems, or if I stress you out and make you anxious, your performance starts to fail and get worse. So positivity, even these tiny little manipulations, can change cognitive performance in really impressive and meaningful ways. And if you've ever had somebody stop and help you pick something up when you've dropped it, you know, what I want to say is positivity is contagious. And I think now of all times, we need to be putting that out into the world. So I'm going to end on some quick takeaways here. What's the first thing I'm going to tell you to do if I want you to be more positive? Smile and sleep. There you go. Second thing is exercise. The third, again, is all about social support and connectedness. Remember that you're not a silo. I'm so happy when I come to give talks to organizations like this because you're doing exactly the right thing. You're together in person, and we benefit so much for that because we evolved in social groups. We really do need each other. Optimism. People ask me, what do you mean? How can I do that? It's as simple as taking quite literally 1 minute to do a daily gratitude exercise. You just picture in your mind 3 things you're grateful for. When we have people do that in the fMRI scanner, by the way, guess what they activate? All of those emotion regulation regions, and the amygdala quiets down. And finally, you can try to really practice and master known emotion regulation strategies where you're using that more newly evolved part of your prefrontal cortex to get better at, first of all, just labeling your emotions. I feel afraid, I feel angry, just labeling them. This works really well in little kids, by the way, for those of you who have grandkids. But because we're adults, we don't have to stop there. We can also then reappraise it. Or apply growth mindset to it. If it's something we feel like we haven't done well or, quote, failed at, we can reappraise or look at that differently as an opportunity for growth and learning. It's always trying to figure out a different way of looking at it. And the final thing, this brings us back to meditation, is truly just simply being in the moment. Because guess where 99.999% of our stress comes from? It's the future or the past. And our mind is just designed to go in one direction or another. One of the things meditation and things like it, we've shown this now at Notre Dame with prayer, by the way, too, same effect. The more you center yourself in the here and now, the less your mind is ruminating in one direction, the future or the past, and that actually, the present is, for the most part, a quite safe place to be. So I'm just going to end by telling you that these 3 domains that we've talked about today, sleep, stress, and emotion, they interact. And they interact because they're so interleaved at the very level of your neurobiology. And the bad news about that is for any one of these areas that you suffer long enough, you're likely to get problems with the other 2. So the longer you stay stressed, the more likely you're to have with problems with sleep and vice versa. And round and round and round you go as you're stuck in what I call the sleep stress spiral, which can become learned, and that makes it harder to get out of. But the good news about this, about all of these areas being so interactive and intertwined, is for any one of these areas where you decide to make a positive change, you're going to get benefits in the other domains as well. So let's just say you decide you're going to try to get those 20 extra minutes of sleep or build a nap into your schedule. Or if you fear that you have a problem with your sleep, you're going to go see a doctor and get it taken care of. Any one of those things is going to give you beneficial effects in the other 2 domains as well. So with that, I just want to thank you for being a great audience. Thank you for having me. Happy to take questions. Just a moment.
What is the effect of chronic use of Ambien?
Chronic use of Ambien. Okay, so I was hoping to I'm going to answer this more broadly, okay? And I'm actually going to preface and kind of caveat the whole thing by telling you if you had 10 sleep neurobiologists up here, we may all give you different answers. So what I'm going to give you is my personal opinion. I'm a PhD, not an MD, so don't sue me. And here's what I genuinely think, okay? There's no doubt that Ambien, Lunesta Sonata, any of the true benzodiazepines that came before it, Klonopin, Xanax, Ativan, they don't produce exactly normal natural sleep, okay? And they were never meant to be taken long-term for sleep disorders. Ambien should ideally be paired with learning cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, where you learn to change your behaviors and your cognitions around sleep so that you can eventually come off of the Ambien. That's how it should work in an ideal healthcare system, which we just don't have. So my answer is, I will always choose to sleep. Whether it doesn't matter to me if that means I have to take Ambien for the rest of my life, which I also may be doing. I think that it is better to sleep than not. At the same time, I wish that we had a sleep healthcare system that would prevent more people from having to take these medications long term when we don't quite know what the effects will be, okay? And I mean that actually for all sleep medications. So by the way, if you are taking over-the-counter sleep medications, those are basically Benadryl. They're antihistamines, okay? And that actually worries me a little bit more. So, I mean, I really would rather, it's sort of like, I'd rather you not take anything long-term, but if you have to, that's the worst one. And then maybe the best one would just be taking melatonin. And for your age group, I don't have, again, I'm not an MD, but for your age group, I don't have a concern about you taking melatonin. Don't have your kids on melatonin, though, because they will stop manufacturing it themselves. And you also don't, because it's not regulated, you also don't know how much melatonin is in those tablets. You know, so again, this is, in an ideal world, we would have a setup where we would make it less likely that you would have to do that. But that's not the world we're in, and so I would always choose sleep over not. Magnesium's fine. Yeah, and the data there are mixed.
Question, could you speak a little bit about diet, both what you eat and when you eat it?
There's not a whole lot of evidence supporting that what you eat matters at all. There really isn't. You know, I mean, people really want there to be, like, it's better to eat meat or don't eat meat. There's just not a lot of data. But when you eat does matter. So if you eat, especially like a spicy meal right before bedtime, and you're at all prone to heartburn, it's just not a good idea. The best advice is to don't eat right before bed. But as far as what you eat, there's just not good evidence that it matters.
What about water in terms of does it affect your the intake to affect your stress, but also your sleep, because you're saying don't drink alcohol or whatever. But
I didn't say don't.
No, I'm saying late, minimize what you drink late. but you know, because if you're drinking water at 10 o'clock at night, you're going to have to get up in the middle of the night and disrupt your
That's
sleep.
where you're going with that. So this is the other thing, and you know, this is predominantly a female audience, so feel free to ask me about hormones if you want to, because that, as many of you know, wreaks absolute havoc, well, on everything, but especially on sleep. But when it comes to water, there are a couple things to do, okay? If you're a woman, you know, you really, and you know that you're gonna get awakened too many times to go to the restroom, if that's one of the things that's waking you up, try to do the majority of your hydration earlier, okay? And then try to drink very little before you go to bed. That should help a little bit. There are also medications you can take, actually, if it really gets to the point where that's waking you up all the time. With men, I get more worried about prostate stuff, you know, heart stuff. I mean, you want to look for swelling in the legs. There are really different things for men and women, and I want to throw that out here because I do see some men in the audience. But that is something you should share with your doctor. Everybody, though, can benefit from not drinking so much right before bedtime. Yes, or I'm sorry, I don't know where the microphone is, but I can hear you. Go ahead.
Can you talk about the correlation between sleep and PTSD and treatments?
It's one of the biggest areas of research that our lab is getting into now. So the question, if not everybody could hear it, is about the relationship between sleep and PTSD. You know, the relationship between sleep and depression, too, they're really fascinating and very similar. So sleep is definitely affected by both of those conditions. What we're learning, though, especially in clinical depression, is that the changes in sleep will often precede the depressive episode. In post-traumatic stress disorder, it also follows it, but people may actually already be more susceptible to PTSD. So let me give you another example of what I mean there. It almost sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it? But we know this from combat veterans who come back and they have PTSD. Of course, if you're watching loved ones get blown up, you yourself have committed atrocities because you had to, you're gonna come back with a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety, and therefore a diagnosis of PTSD is not out of the question, right? This is actually quite common. We've all thought, well, of course, it's because you're under so much stress. And that is true. It is also true, and we know this from twin studies, is that if you send basically twins into combat, and they go in there with a smaller hippocampus to begin with, which, by the way, we all have different sizes of all these different brain regions, because the hippocampus is the negative feedback center for what we call the HPA axis, which is what leads to the secretion of cortisol. It basically just already puts you at risk because you can't manage the stress as well. So it's both. And the answer is almost always it's both. Same with depression. So whatever is going on in your life that is changing your stress physiology may precede you developing insomnia or becoming depressed, but then you also have sleep changes that follow it. And so one of the things that happens when it comes to post-traumatic stress disorder or other anxiety disorders or depression is trying to figure out, which way the causal arrow points. Because then the other thing that happens is people have these negative memory biases. And so we're trying to figure out where's the best place to intervene. Do you try to fix the sleep? Do you try to fix the stress? Do you try to fix the cognitions and the emotions? And ideally, you'd want to do all three, but it's definitely involved.